Hello everyone and welcome to SIGGRAPH, final day here in Denver, Colorado 2024. I'm your host Matthias, aka Major VFX on all the different socials. Accompanied by me today is a number of amazing artists showcasing how they use Maxon 1 to create some of the most stunning visuals you'll see on any screen anywhere in the world. Up to my left is a gentleman who's been working on new technology workflows that will stun and amaze you. Let's give a big Maxon welcome for Byron Stanford.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thanks for coming out. I'm Byron Stanford. I'm a creative director and AI specialist, and I'm here to talk about next-gen 3D workflows today. And I know that that sounds a little bit complex and like it might be too complicated, but I guarantee I'm going to be breaking everything down and making it as simple as possible. So before we jump in, I'm going to show you a little bit of my work. No. Cool. So that was some of my, thank you. So that was some of my work. I do 2D and 3D animation, and I work mostly in Cinema 4D. But as I said, for the last couple of years, I've also been experimenting a lot with new technologies, and I am integrating a lot of new tools, especially AI, which I know is a little bit of a dirty word right now. But I'm here to explain today how AI really is. It is very artificial, but it is not very intelligent. And so we want to make sure that we are bringing that human intelligence and our parts as artists to it and start combining some of these newer programs and newer techniques with our 3D knowledge to actually be able to drive that design and that animation to make it all actually interesting. And all the people that are here today, really, anybody who does animation, VFX, or 3D in general, we're all in a perfect position to actually take advantage of these tools because all of us are very accustomed to learning new programs, learning new techniques, as well as we're all sitting on some of the best kind of like consumer GPUs out there. And that's really all that you need to use these tools. You need an ability to learn something new, to kind of get into a new program and test things out, and a GPU that's going to keep up with your curiosity. So there is already work that's being done out there. There are already studios and clients that are wanting this type of technology to be used, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples. So these are some studios that I've been in the talks with for the last few months. The first example, before I jump into that, these are the three projects that we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to break down three projects in which I'm going to be using these machine learning techniques to kind of help me with either texturing a 3D scene, either also for asset creation and animation, where everything that's in this scene was created with these machine learning algorithms, and also mocap and animation was captured. And finally, combining Mograph and animate diff to create these very complicated animations that really have this painterly look, and you can really style however you want over top. So as I was saying, I'm going to jump into showing you some examples of work that's actually done in the wild today using some of these techniques. So this is from a studio in Sydney, Vandal, and they did a lot of projection mapping and using some of these generative programs and animate diff as well. They used it to build these animations that go over top of the different buildings. And this was done for Vivid in Sydney, which is their lights festival. And they just use different techniques using 3D, using Cinema 4D to drive a lot of these animations, and then project them using depth maps on top of these different buildings. So this is some cool stuff that you don't see every day. This is the studio named Vandal. They're out in Sydney, as I said. Here's another example. This was for a Super Bowl commercial, and this is from the studio Laundry. They're in LA, and they just created this quick animation that I hope you can take a look at.
Artificial intelligence is changing the way we see the world, showing us what we never thought possible, transforming the way we do business.
So this is kind of what you expect a little bit more from when you're using these programs.
Artificial intelligence.
And then the twist is you pull out, and really it was the Minions all along doing it behind the scenes. So this was aired during the Super Bowl, and it was a commercial for Despicable Me. And so this is just to show all of these programs that we're going to talk about today, they have their limitations. They're not perfect. They don't work as easy as I type in something and I get a result. But when you do bring your human intelligence to it, when you do bring your artistry and everything that you know how to do as an artist, you can bring a twist to it, and you can really kind of like push the limits of what you can do. And I'm also happy to announce I'll be doing some of this work as well at Blink in Cincinnati. And so this is happening later in the year, and I'll also be doing camera projection mapping show with like 3D animations that are driving a lot of the artificial intelligence animation over top. So if you're in Cincinnati around these dates, or you're somewhere anywhere near there, come and check it out. I'm working with some other really talented artists, and I think it'll be a lot of fun. So first, let me explain a little bit how these programs work. I know that we are used to rendering, which is you build your scene, you set up your lights, you set up your cameras, and then you tell the engine to render your scene. Diffusion works in a different way. What it does is it takes a random noise and it tries to find an image inside of that noise. And that is either driven by a prompt, or it can be driven by other inputs as well. It's kind of like when you're looking at clouds and you want to see a shape inside of the clouds, and this is a very similar technique. And what the program that I use is Stable Diffusion, and you can use that in two different ways. You have this, which is automatic 1111, which is very complete and it has a lot of stuff. It can do almost anything, but you see it has all these tabs and all these sliders. It's a little bit maybe confusing. And then the other way of using Stable Diffusion is through Comfy UI, which is this node setup. And as 3D artists and 3D designers, we're a lot more comfortable with nodes sometimes. And so the beauty of this setup is that instead of having to load a whole program when I load this up, like when you launch C4D, you kind of have the splash screen and everything has to load, all the plugins have to load. And here what I'm doing is I'm just really bringing in the nodes for the operations that I want. So it's a lot lighter on my machine, and it really is good for my resources. The main reason to use Stable Diffusion is because it has this really handy plugin called ControlNet. And what ControlNet allows you to do is take different inputs, and in this case, I'm using a raw video to kind of like analyze the scene, and then it's going to kind of like extract skeleton information, depth information, or line information, and then I can paint inside of those lines, and I can tell the program what it has to paint over top, how to skin this in different ways, and these are just like different tests of different techniques. So you'll see as we keep going and as I got progressively better at feeding this. Right now, it's kind of jumpy, and it's because it's really estimating from each frame of a video where the depth of each of these characters is. The benefit that we have as 3D designers is that we can export pixel-perfect depth maps, pixel-perfect line maps, and mats from all of our projects and have that drive what we're doing. So that's just a little example. This is what it looks like when it's on my screen. This is one of the projects that we'll look at later. I export a normal pass, I export a depth pass, as well as just like easy coloring, crypto mats for masking, and then a few other passes to kind of reinforce the shape and the movement that I want to get out of this. But let's start going into project number one. This one's talking about texturing. And really, this is the final image that I created from basically just a depth map and a clay render. And I'm going to jump into Cinema 4D in a second here and kind of show you how this is all set up and how we get these maps. This is all created, and we'll see it in a bit. But we can either use it as like our last step for texturing after the whole scene is done, or you could also use it for look dev. So you could throw this in at different values and get different type of styles, and then I could take this into Cinema and I could I could texture my scene according to these different looks. So let's go into Cinema here, and I have my file set up and open. I'm just gonna put this off to the side. So this is my file. It is a kitbash scene from the course Lights, Camera, Render from David Ariev, who's right here as well. Really recommend the course. It is super complete. It talks about everything you need to know about Octane and everything you need to know about C4D as well to build cool scenes like this. And so really, this was just a kitbash. It comes with all of its own materials and everything, but just to show you how it works for this, I deleted all the materials, and so I have an empty scene with just these kitbash. I did start putting in some lighting in there, so you'll kind of see that. But really, all I need to do here, if you can see, when I have my live viewer open, you see I have all these little tabs up down here, and these are my depth pass, and I have my shading normals, and I have a cryptomat, and I have a bunch of other things that I can look at. And I'm going to concentrate on this right now and why I need it, right? That depth information is going to be really good at telling our diffusion model where I want those pixels to be rendered, how close to the camera and how far to the camera. So this is honestly really easy to set up. All you have to do is make sure that in your Save tab, you have the multipass image save. You're telling it where you want it to go. And in this case, I'm going to save it out as a PNG because it's just a still, and I don't really need more than that. Then I'm going to go into my kind of like Octane renderer, and under Render AOV group, you go to your Render AOV Manager, and in here you see I have pulled on some of these mats. And so like you can just choose anything you want and kind of like, you can double click it and it'll add it into here. I don't really need that one right now. But the important one that we're going to talk about right now is the depth pass. And let me make a little bit more space so that you can see it better. So the depth pass has these like values here. And this is really what's going to tell the renderer how much depth I want to render out of this pass. So if I set this very low to say a 10, you see everything is white and I have no contrast in here. And so that's not going to show anything to the diffusion model on where I want those pixels. And if instead of that I set it really far, I set it to 300 for example, then I have mostly all these dark pixels and you can't really see anything. So for every scene and for every different scale that you build into your scene, you're going to have to play around with this number a little bit to find. In this case, I went for 80 because I can see this gradient. It can kind of show that how that depth is working. And my building back here in the back is in the white, and my stuff in the front is dark and black. And I can still see separation in some of these objects. So that's why I went for that value. But for each scene, it'll be different, and for where you place your camera, it'll be different for you as well. And this is really kind of like all I need to export. I can use a few of these different maps. I have the normal in here as well, which we can kind of see here. And the normal is just going to kind of tell us a little bit. In this case, because I have no textures, I'm not using the normal shading, which would usually, this would load in the normal values from the different textures that I have in there. But this is just giving me the geometry, which sides my faces are looking towards the camera, and then that can give me just a little bit more information. And then what I do with this is that I run it through Comfy as well as I let you know. And so you have kind of like your models and your checkpoints that you're loading up on the left, and then you have your inputs in the middle right here. And so these inputs really, here I can show you, I'm just using the depth map, and then I have my clay render that I'm running through one of those pre-processors that I told you about. Because it's just a still, and I don't need this to keep consistency over an animation, just pre-processing it within Comfy UI is enough for me. This is kind of what it's tracing. It's trying to trace and find the internal lines inside of the scene, and that's just going to help me guide a little bit more of the generation that I'm getting. But again, none of this is about trying to get a one-click answer to your work. All of this is like, what can we bring to it to actually make this better? So what I do with these is like, I just rendered a bunch of different styles, and I changed the noise seed a little bit so I can get different looks in all these generations, but as you can see, it keeps the overall structure of the scene. And then I bring these into Photoshop, and I kind of just like take the pieces that I like the most. So I'll paint out mass of what I like from each one, and I'll keep the parts that are the best. Sometimes it's just something small, like just like one little sign in there, and then I put it all together into one image. This one is a little bit dark, so you can't really tell, but when you're doing stuff like that, you're gonna get some hard edges on your mask. You're gonna see that these different pieces from the images don't fit together as nicely. So I'll export that out and I'll bring it back into Comfy, but this time, instead of starting with an empty canvas, I'm gonna start with my image already rendered and generated, and I'm kind of gonna reinforce it with the control net and tell it, hey, I still want it to be this structure, but I'm gonna run it through a really low denoise. And so the denoise value that you see over here, this is what I showed you at the beginning. If I have it up at 100 at 1, it's gonna give me a full noise image, and it's just gonna generate something new. But I set it to 30% to 0.3, and that just means it's gonna add some noise on top of my image and give it that blurriness that I need for the sampler to actually boil that down and bridge all of those seams that I'm gonna have in my images and kind of just make a clean copy. And so this one doesn't have any of those seams. I can bring it back into Photoshop, and I can set my, my different adjustment layers on here, and boom, I have a final image. So now we talked about Octane. Let's do it quickly on Redshift. I'm gonna walk you through a little very easy kind of depth map animation that I used to drive this little animation that you see on the right. And this hasn't been upscaled, it hasn't been touched. It's just like kind of out of the box what you got from what you're seeing here, just boxes moving in a loop, and you get this little animation out of it. So let's jump back into our scene. And in this file, if we have it over here, we don't really care about that. We don't need the live viewer. Now we're in Redshift. In this scene that you can see here is very easy. It's just one camera and a bunch of cloners, just setting these cubes along this floor that I have. And then I have two cameras, and I'm morphing through them together. And so with the morph camera, I'm kind of like advancing, and it all loops because they're just duplicated cloners. But what I want to show you here is through Redshift, once we render this, we're going to see kind of the same thing. You do have to have your bucket renderer turned on so that you can get the different maps, because if you don't have the bucket renderer, you'll see that the only options I have here are the normals, which, as we know, there's no textures on here, so there's no real normals. But once I do turn on the bucket rendering, now I can check my depth, and I can check my crypto mat, for example. This is going to be very handy later in the next project we're going to look at for masking. So, but let's talk about the depth, because that's really what matters here. So now we got to make sure that we're on Redshift. Again, make sure that you're saving your multipass, and then in Redshift, usually it'll be here on basic, and you can see that when I'm rendering this, I don't need the quality to be great. It's on a low quality. But if you go into the Advanced tab, and you find your AOVs and then your AOV manager, we have something very similar to what we saw before in Octane. We have all of our maps in here that we can just kind of like choose and bring in if we need. In this case, Redshift will usually start with this in Z, and that gives us nothing. We'll see only white, and you might be a little bit confused. And you're like, well, where's my depth pass? I'm not seeing it. So the cool thing about Redshift is that it does have a Z normalized inverted, and the inverted is really what we need to bring into Comfy. We want the white pixels to be in the front and the black pixels to be in the back. When you get it from Octane, it'll be flipped. All you have to do is invert that mask, and that's it. And so the way I set this up in Redshift is that if you use the near camera far, this is what's going to tell the camera what's near my camera and what's far. And so like I click on use camera near far, and then in my camera, if I'm here, I have this clipping. And now I'm going to be looking at my viewport for this to help me kind of like figure it out. And here I already have it dialed in, but if I start playing with these values, you can see here in the bottom, there's this line that's moving. And if I'm pushing my depth further and further away, I'm clipping out of my image. And so you'll see now in the render, when I'm doing the depth pass, I'm losing the front of this image and I'm not getting that depth information. So I want to make sure that I'm setting this depth closer to where the camera and where it's intersecting with the floor. And for the far, it's kind of the same deal where I want to play with this and I have a handy little line that I can see here on my top view, for example, that as I bring the depth down, that line starts getting closer and it's going to clip out the information. So you just want to play with those for the scale of your scene and make sure that you have enough information that you're rendering out something that's useful to you. And using this technique is how I did these animations here. And this is a project that Will Harvey Revelo created, and he does these very cool VJ loops that he puts to music. And so I took that 3D file that he let me use, and I exported a depth pass, an emission pass, and a normals pass as well. And then I used those to run it through Comfy and to skin this in all sorts of different styles. And of course, the 3D version that he has of this looks amazing, and it's a great animation. This is just some type of animation that you can't usually get out of a 3D package. You can't usually, it's a lot harder to get something like this out of Cinema directly. You would have to play around with the toon shader a lot. Then you also have all this different morphing that's happening. So it's a very, it's a look, and it's something that you have to want to go for, but it is very interesting to play around with. So let's talk about this second project, which is all about asset creation and animation. And this is a little animation I'm putting together and I'm currently working on. But everything that you see in this scene was generated using machine learning algorithms and was animated as well using machine learning techniques. So I'm going to show you a couple of tools that I've been using to create these assets, but everything I'm talking about here could be applied equally to if you ever get assets off of like somebody on Fiverr and they're not very detailed. So you'll see, for example, what I did here is that I took these assets and I gave them this like clay look. I used these super cool grayscale gorilla textures for clay to just get actually like, I can't pause it at the right time. To like lean into the fact that these aren't perfect meshes. These weren't modeled by a 3D designer. They aren't great. The topology on them is a little bit wonky sometimes. So using that and bringing some of that like human intelligence into this is how we're going to create more interesting animations. So this is one of the tools that I used, Meshy, and really you just type in kind of like what you want to see and it'll give you some options for meshes, and then you can refine them at different levels, and then you can get your final mesh. And this works pretty fine. It works with some credits that you load onto the scene. But there's this other page that I've been using, and you can see I created all of my characters that we were looking at using this tool, Hyperhuman Rodin. This was super useful for me. I really loved how it worked. And so I'm just going to walk you through how this really works. You come in here, you kind of type out what you want to see, what you want to create. In this case, a cute fluffy cat, and it's going to give you, oh, hey, I think this is what you want to create. And what's cool about this is it has this kind of like re-roll button that you can push. And I can just push that as much as I want until I get to an image that I'm like, oh, that one looks maybe like more like what I was going for. And then you click generate, and it's going to create kind of like this very, very rudimentary 3D mesh. And it's going to be like, this isn't the final mesh that you're going to get, but it's like, hey, is this what you want? And you'll see that you have, on your right side, you kind of have like more prompting that you can do. You can give it a lot of other details to try and make this mesh as much as you want. But especially it has this redo button, and you have up to 20 redos for any given mesh. So you can kind of click through them, and I clicked through a few, and you can see I used a few of these until I got to a mesh where I was like, well, I like those whiskers. Let me confirm this and generate it. And after a couple of minutes, this is the mesh that I'm getting from Hyperhuman. And so, as I said, they're not perfect meshes, but they are a good start. The next step would be the material generation. It's very similar. It already made us this image, and it's going to try to create this texture and project it onto our mesh. In the same way, in this case, you have 6 redos for the material generation. So the thing that's interesting about this is that you can't go back. If you click redo and it makes me a new texture, if I see something I like, I kind of have to confirm it, because if I re-roll and I get something I don't like, then I'm stuck if I run out of redos. But say I like this, I just click on it and I have my mesh and my materials. And now I'm going to talk about how I did the mocap. And that was using Move One. It's an app that you can download onto your phone. And you can see me here like acting out my mocap in my living room. And this is just off of my iPhone. It's capturing this video and then uploading it. And a few minutes later, I get the skeleton and all the mocap information that I need to animate my characters. So let's jump into C4D again and show you. This is the more fun part of these projects, how I use that information and how I put it onto my characters that I already generated online. So loading up the scene, you can see I have my little Astro Girl in here, but I'm going to bring in and do this from scratch for you guys so that you can see how I created it. So from Move One, I directly get this FBX, and when I drag it into Cinema, it's going to start a new project in here, and you can kind of see this guy came in, but he's all like laying on the floor, not good. But it comes in with all its materials, all these different shapes, and here I have the mocap information and the skeleton. So the first bone that you see here, it's this big bone that they call root. We don't really need it. This is the one that we kind of want to rotate to have him stand up. But you can see if I go into coordinates, this is keyframed. It's keyframed at nothing. Nothing is changing over time, really, for the root. Even though the mocap is happening, the root just has a keyframe at 0. So I'm just going to get rid of that. Go into the animation track and delete that track. So I don't have a keyframe here. And now I can send him to -90, and now he's standing. This is a more normal pose that we want to see when we have our mocap. And now when I keyframe through it, you can see the little robot doing what we just saw recording myself in my living room, right? So now I want to get this animation and put it onto my mesh that I generated. So the first thing that I did was use Mixamo to rig those 3D meshes that I showed you. And I'm just going to run through this quickly because there's a lot of good tutorials out there on how to use Mixamo. But basically, it's this Adobe tool, and you can just upload your own character. You need an OBJ or an FBX, and you set up these markers on where your different parts of the body are. And then after a few minutes, you have a rigged character that uses a Mixamo rig skeleton. So that's really all that we need to kind of bring into Cinema. And I have my Space Girl in here. And what I do from Cinema is that I export her in a T-pose. And I bring this in pressing Shift to make sure that she comes into my same scene. And now you see my Space Girl is here in her T-pose, and I'm going to move her off to the side so that we see them side by side. But she has no motion on her. She's just still. I want to take the motion from my Move One character and put it onto my Mixamo rig. So what I need to do for that is, as I said, you can see the Mixamo rig starts with the hips. That's like my top bone is the hips. So again, this top bone is the root. It's that big bone. I don't really want that one. I'm going to click on the hips here. And now that I have the hips of my robot selected, my Move One robot, I'm going to right click, go into rigging tags, and choose character definition. That's going to add my little tag in here. I'm going to name this source just so that I know what I'm doing. And I'm going to click on open the manager. Once you open the manager, all you have to do is click on extract skeleton, and that's going to detect all of my bones. And I'm going to set this as a reference. I'm going to go to frame -1, where it's the mocap character that you bring in comes at frame -1 in a T-pose. And let me move her out of the way again. So he comes in a T-pose at frame -1. So I'm going to set this as my reference pose so that in case I touch anything in the mocap and it gets messed up, that I can always go back to this T-pose. And that's all I need to do here. Now I'm going to click her. I'm going to click on her hips again and do the same thing. Put in a rigging tag, choose character definition. I'm going to name her target. Open the manager, same thing I did. Extract the skeleton. It detects all the bones that I have in here, and I'm going to set my reference pose to this T-pose. Now, all I have to do right now, there's still no animation on her. All I have to do is click on Create Solver down here. That's going to add another tag onto my Mixamo rig. And really, it's as easy as dragging my first character into the source character, and boom. Now it's referencing that animation, and this character that I generated in only a few minutes now is fully animated and rigged, and it's doing the motion that I did in my living room. And when I did it, when I recorded myself, I kind of I knew that she had this big helmet, and so I kind of put my hands out to the side. I didn't really fully put them on my face to try to account for that, but still, they're a little bit too close. They're clipping through the big helmet, so I want to fix that. I can edit this mocap further a little bit, but before I do that, let's take a look. If you look, I'm going to push Shift F3 to go into my dope sheet. If we look at our dope sheet, we can see that there's no keyframes on my girl. She's just really doing exactly what my robot guy is doing, just referencing that animation. So I couldn't really copy her out of this file and bring her into anywhere else. So before I can do any editing to her keyframes, I'm going to go into Animate, and I'm going to make sure that I choose her, and I'm going to add a motion clip. This is going to bring this up where it's going to tell me where do I want the... Animate, add motion clip. And this is choosing my T-pose, which is not what I want. I want it to go from -1 to 662. So that's how long my timeline is, and that's the keyframes that I want it to bake down. And then I am not going to click Remove Included Animation because I want it to keep the animation. I'm going to see if this actually works because I think something is a little bit wonky, but it might work. And no, I chose the wrong thing, and I baked the T-pose into him instead of baking his animation into her. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to click on him, make sure that I have him selected because he's the one that's animated. And now, when I go to Animate, Add Motion Clip, now this is what I was hoping for. It goes from start -1 to end 62. I don't want to remove the include animation. And now I can bake it down. And now I have this motion source that I can now use onto her. And, oh, I know what I did wrong. I'm sorry, guys. Let me restart this. So before I go into motion clips, the first thing that I want to do is go into her function and bake down the animation. I want to bake the objects. So now I do have start from -1 to end 662. I don't want to create a copy. I just want to bake down all her animation into keyframes. And so now, yes, it took all those keyframes and it put it onto her rig. And now I can actually delete this guy, get him out of my scene, and I still have the animation on her, which before, if I deleted him, it was just referencing his animation, so I wouldn't have kept the motion with it. So now let's go into the motion system to see how we can edit this mocap and change this kind of part that we have where she's touching her face, but it's clipping through the helmet. So now we can go into Animate, make sure that you select her, Animate. All right, make sure you select her in the manager. Add motion clip. Again, I don't want to remove the included animation, I just want to add that motion clip. And now this is baked down into a motion clip, and you can see here it has its own layer. And so It's also added this tag over here, which if you ever get lost, you can say, hey, open this in the timeline. It'll show you the motion system. And now all I have to do really, if I wanted to change this animation that I have, I'm going to add a layer in here. So if I click add, you see it's going to add another layer. I want that layer 1 to go over my layer 0. And now I can add different keyframes and change this mocap. So let me get a little bit closer so that we can see what we're doing. And you can see at around here, I like where her arm is, but then after that, she's going to start clipping in. So I'm going to go to right here. I'm going to twirl down on my skeleton, and I'm going to find her left shoulder, open that up. We have the left arm, we have the left forearm, and we have the left hand. And these are the two that I'm going to want to change. So let me go in here. First, I'm going to set keyframes for this position because I like where these are right now, but I'm going to change them in a few frames. So keyframe these. And now I'm going to move up to where my mocap is clipping, and here's where I want to make changes. And they're going to go onto this layer 1. So here now I can choose my forearm, go to the rotate tool, rotate this out, make sure that she's not clipping through, kind of like give that a little bend, and now I can keyframe that. And here, go to my left hand and do kind of the same thing, just rotate it to where I would want it, and I can really direct where I want this hand to go, and then keyframe that. And now, I could go over and do that to the other hand as well, but now we have our mocap, and boom, now she's not really clipping through. There's a few frames here where maybe she clips through, and I could kind of go in here and say left forearm, bring that down so that she's not doing that, bring that out. Keyframe that again. So this top layer that I have here is making changes to the motion clip that I have underneath, and it's changing everything moving forward, right? And so the problem is after this, if we zoom out and we go to the end of the animation, her arms were supposed to come down, but it's still applying my layer 1 animation onto that arm, and I don't really want that. So at about here when she's bringing her arm down, I want the strength of layer 1 to kind of go away. So I'm going to keyframe that, set it to 100 here, and then go forward a few frames to here and set that to 0. Not to minus anything, but just to 0. And with 2 keyframes, now that layer is not affecting my underlaying mocap, and so she goes back to normal, and her arm is doing whatever the mocap was doing. So that's how I kind of directed the motion on the characters, and I'm going to jump into the scene here to show you how this claymation scene was set up, just so that you can see it all applied into one scene. And so this is done in Redshift, so I'm also going to bring my Redshift render view up, dock this over here, and we can kind of render it. So I have all my cameras set up, and everything that you see in the scene, using that tool that I showed you before, was all generated in really a couple of minutes. And then using the Move 1 app that I showed you before, I brought in all the mocap for my 2 little characters, and they have their little animation, and you can really kind of like make your own animations very quickly like this. Like this was done really in only only a day really. And then I kind of have like this other stuff going on in the background. Also everything generated in here, but I have this little like airplane with a cloth tag in there just to kind of like add something more to the scene. When you're looking at our main characters, it's just some background elements. They don't have to really be in frame. But let's talk about the materials that I've been using, because when you download these assets, or when if you get assets from, say, as I said before, somebody on Fiverr, and they're only giving you an albedo map, or the mesh itself maybe isn't very perfect. And if we go in here, we can kind of see those polygons like I showed you before. So it's not. It's like okay, but there's some imperfections in here. So to hide that kind of stuff, what I really want to do is I'm using these Grayscale Gorilla textures. They have some really amazing clay textures, and I drop them in and put them on a triplanar, to make sure that it all gets projected onto my characters. And so you can see it here, how it gives her that look that she's almost made, like sculpted out of clay. And that's going to hide those imperfections in the mesh quite a bit. And so the best way to do that really is to just drop in your different maps from, either textures that you have or from the Grayscale Gorilla textures. You throw them into a triplanar, and I have this collapse just to make some space. And I have a common scale vector that just scales this up and down. And you can see, I like soloing the normal map because I can kind of really tell what's going on here with the displacement. You can see that depending on the scale that I give this, like if I just give this a 0.1, that packs that texture in there really, really small. And this is not what I'm going for. I really want to kind of see those bigger imperfections. Like I really sculpted this with my own fingers, and I went in there. And so that normal map is very handy to solo it, just clicking on this little solo button, and really see what you're doing in there and how to map this on. And then the last field that we have, and this comes directly, same with those Grayscale Gorilla textures, is your height displacement field. And to make sure that this works applied to our different elements in the scene, you need to make sure that you're adding a redshift object tab. So you're going to add this to any object in your scene that you want to see displacement on. So you add your redshift object. You go into the geometry. You're going to click your override, because you'll see that once I turn it off, the only thing driving the displacement is the normal map. And so like you can kind of tell like it's there, but it's not really displacing the geometry. So then you turn on your override, you turn on your displacement as well, and then that's going to cause it to have a lot more of that texture come through. I'm going to have to maybe refresh that so that we can actually see it. And so really that's all it is when it comes to, you can see it a little bit better in this lighting. When it comes to the textures, again, just bringing in part of that human intelligence and being smart about how you're building your scene to make the most out of either the assets that you have or the different animations that you can get. So you can capture motion data just with your phone from your home, project it onto your characters, and then make, this is kind of like I showed you at the very beginning how this project went. And these are just a quick few scenes rendered out in one day with these two little characters interacting, and they have this little cute interaction. He stands up, and yeah. And so this is something I'm working on, and hopefully it'll be a cute little animation to see after. And now let's go over to our third project. And this one is really interesting to me because it's combining Mograph elements and Animate Diff. And what Animate Diff is doing is telling Comfy to take these elements and these inputs that I'm giving it and skin over top of them, right? And so I can give this almost any look that I want, and I can set in different inputs for style references, or I can prompt this however I want. But what's interesting here, if you see, is that it's consistent. It actually, like, I can skin this however I want. I'm still getting the same shape of the shoe. I'm still getting the swoosh in there. I'm making sure that I'm driving the animation and getting really what I want. And so that's what excites me about this, that we can use some of these tools and really make something super interesting. So let's jump into Cinema again so that I can show you how I created these. Oh, and these are the maps that I'm exporting from Cinema. So I'm doing a depth pass. I'm doing a normal pass. I'm using very simple materials to do masking, because then I can route this within Comfy to separate into red, green, and blue for masks and tell it, hey, on the red, I want you to give me flowers. On the green, I want you to give me something else. On the blue, it's the background. And then I'm just doing a pass for just the swoosh so that I can kind of like reinforce that shape is something that I want. And then over here on the right, a little bit bigger, I've done this with the Toon Shader. I have this like line pass. The line passes really give us a lot of more detail in the animation and really help kind of like separate these different pieces and tell Comfy that these are separate pieces that are kind of like rolling away, and I want you to take those and generate over top of those. And so I'm gonna, then the way that I use them, I kind of showed you this before. I use those 5 little exports to drive my control nets. And at different weights, I kind of tell it what to look at. So like, I really want to go heavy Over here on the strength, you can see on the depth pass, I really want like 90% of that depth pass to give me strength. The normal pass, I really barely even want because it's going to give me a lot of that bump texture. So I got that at 0.05 for the strength. For the details with the line, I want it at 40%. And so that's going to, when you start tweaking those values, is when you can really get into customizing these things. But let's jump into Cinema here for a third project. So we're going to go to the sneaker. And you'll see in here what I have. I don't need this. I also don't need this. This is what we have. So I'm going to break down the scene quite a bit, and we might actually have time to rebuild it. But there's a lot of techniques in here that, if you checked out Harrison's talk right before this, he really goes into a lot of Mograph and how to do great animation that way. And so those techniques would also be super helpful. So, but just to break it down for you, what I have is a low poly version of the sneaker in a Voronoi fracture, because I really want it to make it easy on the Voronoi fracture to kind of separate it and break it up. And then I have a high poly mesh of the shoe over top. And if you look at my render, you can see that I'm kind of fading between one and the other. And I'm going to break down how I do that in a second. I do that with vertex maps, but just so that we can see what we're doing here. This is the low poly shoe, and I have it in the Voronoi fracture. And then what I'm doing with it is that I'm applying a few different Mograph effectors. So the first one is going to be, I drop in a plane effector, and I just named it location so that I know what it's doing. And this effector is only touching our position. And let me change this so that we can see a little bit better what we're doing. I'm going to bring these textures down. So that's just the green and blue textures that I told you before. And the way that I have these set up, by the way, so that I can have the green only on the inside, if you go into your Voronoi fracture and you go to selections, you can toggle these on and off. And so I just selected inside faces and outside faces, and it gives me these two little selection tags. And then in my material, under selection, I drag the one that I want. So I want the green for the inside, and I want the red for the outside faces, and boom. That's all that there is for like texturing in these two different colors. But let's talk about the Voronoi fracture now, because you'll see I'm going to turn off my rotation and my scale effectors, and you'll see if I only have my location set up with this linear field, that's really what's driving this animation. I have that linear field keyframed, and it's moving through my shoe. And you can see it, and really all that it's doing is displacing those different pieces and forming the shoe back up here, right? So that's what that linear field is doing. And then if I go to my fields in here, in the plane effector, I added a shader field over top, and I set it to overlay just to add a little bit more displacement to that, just so it's not one-to-one with the linear field. So you can see if I turn that off, it's a lot more linear. Everything stays a lot more stacked because it's being moved by the same values. But once you turn on the shader field, you have a little bit of that variation, and you can jump into your noise here and kind of like mess with how big you want that noise to be and how much you want it to displace. The next step, I put in a rotation effector. So it's a plane effector. You find those under Mograph effector, and you just bring in a plane effector. And I just renamed it to rotation because the parameter that I had set up, it comes down with position, and I don't really need that. But I changed this to affect only the rotation, and then I can play with these values and kind of give these little pieces that I'm breaking off different nuances to like that rotation. And that just gives it that extra little spin to the pieces. But again, now we're just moving them up kind of like in the frame, and we're rotating everything, so we're making it green. But I also want these to disappear as I'm moving through them with the plane with the linear field. And so I drop in my last plane effector, and I rename that scale. And so what I have activated here is the scale, and I choose uniform scale, and I give it a value of -1. And you'll see that once I activate that, now these pieces, once they're past the linear field, they start shrinking down until they disappear from the scene. And so that's really all I need to do to set up that Voronoi fracture. But you'll see if I want to give this tune shader again, if I want to give my Voronoi fracture a tune shader because I really want to get those lines out of the render, and I'm just going to create a new material and go tune and drop it on here. I'm going to get rid of these two. It's giving me all these internal lines on the tune shader, right? And I don't want to see the Voronoi fracture lines before I move my linear field through it. So I want to wait until these are broken pieces to actually get to see these internal lines. So what I did with that instead, let me delete this off of here and show you a little bit of how I made this material. This is your normal tune shader, not the high poly mesh, but the Voronoi one. So I'm going to put it on here. And now we can see it's only affecting the pieces that have already passed through my linear field. And the way I do that is I just add a vertex map onto my low poly shoe. And I'm going to drive this vertex map information from my linear field. So just to, this has a bunch of stuff that we didn't really need in here. I can delete that just to make it easier on you. So just that we can see what the vertex map is doing, I duplicated this same linear field and I tucked it underneath the first one so that if I ever change the animation on this first one, the second one will move the same. And I changed the, so in the vertex map, if you go under fields, I changed the remapping of this and I set the strength, the inner offset to 99 because I don't want to see the gradient. If I have this inner offset set to 0, which is what it comes in as, it's really giving me this gradient. And I don't want the tune shader to do this. I want it to really only affect the pieces that have already gone through the linear field. So again, setting that to 99 will give me that effect that I want. That's only the last pieces that have gone through the linear field are affected by my offset in here. And that's, I changed the wrong thing, and it's the inner offset that I want to be affecting. So inside of my texture, if we open up the node editor, now you can see that what I did, this is your regular tune shader material, and it comes with all these nodes. And all I had to drop in here is a vertex attribute, which you can just press C for the commander, type vertex in here, and it's going to have this vertex attribute node. This is really what I have in here. And into the attribute name, I dragged in my vertex map, and then I set the out color of that to the opacity on my main material, but also on this contour. So the contour is what's telling my tune shader how thick these lines are. And when I pipe the vertex color into my opacity, I'm also telling it, hey, these lines, I don't want you to render them until I've changed the vertex weight on them. And so that's really all that this material is. And then I inverted that and did the opposite for the high poly mesh. And so for the high poly mesh, the same way, I have a vertex asset on it. As you can see here, I have that same linear field because I want to use the same one so that I'm not having to create a bunch of different linear fields for each one. And here you can see the effect of the vertex map. As that linear field is crossing through it, you can see that it's painting my vertex and giving me that information. When I then use that in my node editor in my material, that this vertex attribute is what's giving it that color information into the opacity. So it's basically saying, let's put this down here. It's basically telling Cinema, hey, as you're painting on my vertex weight, I want you to change the opacity on the main, on your main material and also on the contour, also on those lines, because you can see my high poly mesh has a lot more details in here. I can see all the shoestrings, I can see the swoosh in here, I can see all these little like breaks in the shoe style. So that's really what I want to export and bring into my different nodes, as I was telling you before. And then all I have to do really is come up with different styles These are some tests that I did, and you can go for a painterly style. You can start playing around with different effects. And here are just some of the exports that I get from using this technique. So as I said, you have an underwater one, you have this particle generation one, you have one coming out of like the flowers and the lights and stuff. And these are all just different generations of the same thing. Not a look that you could easily get out of cinema necessarily. You could to get this painterly effect is really hard out of 3D software. But again, I'm creating these just by kind of coming up with different inputs and adjusting those sliders, and but it's still retaining the size, the shape of the shoe, the size, that swoosh. So I really can kind of make sure that I get granular, and if I'm doing this for a client, I can make sure that I'm making it the way that I want it to show up on the screen. So again, those are the 3 little projects that I talked you through today. Thank you all for coming out. Again, thank you. I hope that what you take from this is that these tools are out there and they can be useful, but they're not your end solution. You need to bring some of that human intelligence with you and actually use them to the maximum of your ability and to as far as they will go, and you have to kind of put in the rest. You kind of have to put in your expertise in 3D, in 2D, or anything else to kind of build this up and actually make a good final render and a good final project.
Awesome. Let's hear it for Byron again. That was a really solid presentation. So many different workflows. One of the things I've heard is prompt but modify.
Yes.
It's you definitely want to modify. You don't want that cookie cutter design. Exactly. And you've done so many modifications there. Everything looks like your own. I haven't seen those workflows before. So thanks so much for sharing. Byron will be available for the next hour at our Dell station if you have questions. But we do have time for 1 or 2. So questions from our live audience. They're just sitting stunned. You just stunned the audience. Well, if
means I explained everything well.
Yeah, you did. That means you killed it. So find them online. If not, stay tuned. We're going to be going into ZBrush land. It's about lunchtime. You know what that means. We're going to be bringing Patrick 4D to the stage to make us some lovely food in ZBrush. So stay tuned. We'll see you after the break.
Thank you.